Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Elise Zipkin. She is Cedar Distinguished Professor and Director of the Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior Program in the Department of Integrative Biology at Michigan State University. And today we're going to focus on topics such as animal population dynamics, species distribution, biodiversity, human activities, conservation, invasive species, and climate change, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Zipkin, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
So, perhaps before we get into more specific things, let me just ask you about two or three concepts here for people to understand what we're going to talk about. So one of the things you study is animal population dynamics. So what is that, and what kinds of questions do you explore there?
Yeah, good question. So basically, my lab is interested in understanding the abundance and distribution of species, mostly animal species, although we do work on some plants. And I'm sorry about that.
No problem.
So we work on estimating the abundance and distributions of species and how they change with things like other environmental change, climate change, and other kinds of human and natural disturbances. So what we're interested in is why are populations changing? What causes populations to and communities of species to change through time? I mean, first, to understand that, we need to understand what's a baseline. What do we see now? What have we seen in the past? And then we try to look at, all right, what do we also think about might happen in the future under different kinds of environmental change that we may have, or even things that are possibly a little bit less likely, but we still want to know what the possibilities might look like.
But in your specific case, do you focus only or mostly on anthropogenic activities and how they impact species population dynamics, or do you also focus or try to study how those dynamics change through natural processes?
Yeah, we also try to understand how populations change through natural processes, like if there were no kinds of human interventions or human disturbances. And the reason you have to do that, if you were focused only on wanting to understand, the effects of anthropogenic activities, you would still need to know how does the population, what would you expect naturally to happen? So there's no real way to study, what's going on with the effects of human intervention if we don't really understand, what we would expect to see with the population. So most of the models that we're doing, we're incorporating both of those things, or the things that we think are relevant for that specific population or community of species, to get the full picture.
And what does species distribution mean? What is
Yeah,
that exactly?
that is such a good question. You sent that question, and I thought, that's a very insightful question, because the truth is, it's really hard to understand it. So in the kind of broadest sense, what we really want to understand is, where does this species exist and where does it not exist? And you can think of kind of like a range. Okay, this species occurs in, the western part of North America. But of course, within that, it's not occurring at every location within there, right? And these processes are dynamic, so they're not really static through time. There's something that are kind of always changing. So it is a really really good question. It's a useful concept for us, right? Because if we constantly were thinking about all the nuance, it would be difficult to ever get things done. But so in the broadest sense, right, it's just like where that species is existing, delineating kind of that area. But once you really dig down deep into it, it becomes really complicated.
But when it comes to species distribution, are you trying to understand what are the factors that play a role in a particular species being able to live and adapt to different sorts of ecological conditions? Is that it?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. I mean, so basically we want to understand those factors that are in particular locations, how much they're affecting, the species either occurring there, or how many of that you see there. Like, let's say it was some sort of, bird species, a species that we think of typically as inhabiting forest, forest habitat. But the forest itself has a lot of nuance and variation. There might be differences in the canopy cover, what the tree looks like, what the understory looks like, how much brush there is. And so it's not the same throughout. So we're trying to understand, those factors. Okay, maybe it's a forest bird and we expect it to be here, but is it in certain locations at higher or lower densities because of the kind of habitat that we see in those areas?
And so I would imagine that it also include factors like, I don't know, temperature and latitude and the different kinds of food that each species would have available and can consume, all of those
Yeah,
sorts
yeah.
of environmental factors, right?
Yeah, so there are all sorts of things that would affect like where a species would occur, right? The kinds of things that we
Mhm.
all think about, that every animal needs food, needs shelter, other types of resources, those sorts of things. And so we are always including it, but you bring up a really good point, which is we may think something's really important, but we may not have the data available
Yeah,
to actually include it, right?
yeah.
So you said something about the food. Well, we might know broadly how the food of an organism, is distributed, but we may not have the data really to know that at a very fine granular level. So that's also like what makes this process really complicated.
And so perhaps the question that most people would be interested in here in this conversation, because of course environmentalists also talk a lot about it. What is biodiversity? What does that mean in the context of biology and environmentalism?
Yeah, so biodiversity is just simply, the variety of life on Earth. And you can think about it, sometimes we're thinking about it the whole globe. What does that biodiversity look like across the planet? But also sometimes we're thinking about it on a smaller scale. What does the
Mhm.
biodiversity look like in these particular areas? And the reason we care about that, right, is because biodiversity and higher biodiversity is linked to all sorts of things that are beneficial to both, humans and natural and managed ecosystems, right?
Mhm.
So biodiversity is linked to, things like clean water, clean air, the production of food. So even in managed habitats, like even in agricultural fields, we can see that higher biodiversity of certain kinds of insects or even plants in between those, row crops can lead to better outcomes for, crops, for managed crops. So there's all sorts of reasons why biodiversity has many benefits, both to natural systems and to people as well.
But is it always better to have more biodiversity, or I mean, how should we think about it exactly?
That's also a really good question. I mean, that's something that ecologists debate, right? Is higher biodiversity always better? And it's pretty nuanced. I would say that, some places on the globe, right? Like if you think about the equator, there's more, there's higher biodiversity in areas around the equator and tropical ecosystems compared to like, let's say polar regions, the Arctic or Antarctic. So we can't like naturally say, okay, it's better, the area around the equator is better than, the areas around the poles, right? Because they're really different kinds of ecosystems and they would sustain life in really different ways. And there just would be maybe a lower carrying capacity for organisms in Arctic systems. Um, so I can't say that it's always better. What I would say is that, as for people, one of the things that's probably the best is to think about trying to maintain or restore amounts of biodiversities that have historically been in the regions that, that we're thinking about, right? So
Mhm.
thinking about populating with native species that have been in areas, since the last ice age kind of a thing. That's probably the best way I think to think about it. So it's not just more is better everywhere. We want everywhere to have the most. We want, to think about what kind of native plants and animal species and fungi and bacteria, there are in different parts of the globe for different reasons.
So, since I mentioned the environmentalists, I guess that one question that people would have at this point is why then should we care about biodiversity?
Yeah. So as I was saying, like the biodiversity is really what maintains life on Earth, right? So in
Mhm.
addition to all the things about, cycling nutrients in our systems, helping to produce clean water, also, there's all sorts of issues, like all of our medicines basically are derived from natural compounds. We are constantly exploring. I mean, scientists are constantly exploring the medicinal properties of plants, for example, and those end up being part of, the important medications that we all use. So really, reduced biodiversity is going to make our lives harder. And there'll be some thresholds where it will make it, in reality, where it would be very difficult for people to exist, so it has a lot of properties, I think, that humans rely on, whether we're thinking about it every day.
Right. So, I mean, I hope that this is not too broad a question, but what gives rise to biodiversity and what are the kinds of factors that play a role in how it increases or decreases over time?
Yeah, that's a really hard question too. And again, that's like whole fields that people study. But I would say, it's this interaction of ecology, which is how species interact with their environments and other different species, each their own population, their own individuals within their species, and also individuals outside of their species, and also evolutionary processes, right? So maybe some of your audience has heard of things like natural selection, which is the process by which organisms speciate through time. So new individuals happen. So we tend to think of that through some random processes of mutation, and maybe movement of species, and also related to, what the environmental process is like in particular locations. But one thing I think that's really important to note is the process of creating species, right, is much, much slower than, for example, the process by which we are currently losing species. So there's no way, right? We think of speciation as, something that happens on geological time. Whereas right now, the loss of biodiversity that we're experiencing, those rates are comparable to, the 5 mass extinctions that we've seen in the past, in the fossil record, for biodiversity. So it's not like we're going to be able to, in a short time frame, easily replace biodiversity that we've lost. But obviously on geological times, that will kind of there'll be more life on Earth and more variety of life on Earth. But of course, we don't know what that looks like.
Right. But what kinds of human activities tend to have an impact on things like species distribution and biodiversity?
So really, I would say, you could kind of think of it as almost everything we do has an impact. That's not to say that it's a negative impact,
Okay.
right? But when we're obviously, like, if we're doing things like removing habitat, so that's a big one, where we build our houses, where we build our cities, even in rural areas where we modify landscapes, that's going to have an impact on, the other organisms that live in that area. And even things about, though, areas that we keep for parks or areas that we keep natural, the kinds of management we do also has impacts on biodiversity in maybe positive or negative ways, right? And not all biodiversity is necessarily going to respond, to the kinds of, I'll say, disturbance, but it could be, changes that humans make in the same way. Some kinds of subspecies, we may put in lawns in our yard. For the most part, lawns, for example, are decrease biodiversity, right? Decrease the amount of species that we see there. But some species are going to increase in those kinds of monoculture, environments. So things will always respond differently. Different species will respond differently to different stressors and different changes that we see.
And what about the specific case of agriculture? How can it affect different animal species?
Yeah, agriculture is a really good one because obviously it's hugely important, right? I mean, we all need agriculture everywhere around the world. It's not going anywhere, and it has a huge benefit for humans.
Mhm.
But there's a ton of research, tons of research my university at Michigan State, but also all over the world, where people are trying to think about, all right, how do we implement agriculture in ways that are both good for the environment, good for the native species that are there in the region, and also can increase crop yields. So agriculture is a really interesting one. Historically, we might think about like, okay, people come into an area, they clear the area, they plant their plants. But what we found through time, right, is that if you try to continually do that and just plant, species for food through
Hmm.
time, we see that the productivity of that land can go down, right? So it becomes
Right.
really important to let those lands be fallow or to think about managing them in a way that can promote biodiversity. And we've seen in some situations that that can really lead to much higher yields, especially through time. So there's lots of research being done on, crop rotations, putting in prairie strips around agriculture that can improve biodiversity, but those outcomes also end up being really good in many situations for the production of crops. So tons of research on that, especially in the Midwestern US where, there's a lot of agricultural land. That's a big, big area of research. I think that's both improving food production and improving biodiversity, natural biodiversity in those areas.
Because there are also some wild species that can have a positive role in agriculture, right?
Right, exactly. There can be a lot. I mean, there are, of course, pests. I mean, we're also
Hmm.
thinking about, people are also thinking about ways, yeah, how do
Yeah.
you prevent, let's say you're growing blueberries, which is something popular in the state of Michigan. How do you prevent, birds from eating them? So, I mean, we understand that side of it too, but it's not like you're going to want to remove all the birds from the system, right? Because on the other hand, other birds are eating insect pests, right, that
Right.
are problematic for the blueberries. So it becomes kind of this complicated game where you're trying to figure out, all right, what's the best approach for getting the outcome that we want, but also for maintaining a healthy ecosystem so that people into the future are going to be able to use this lands, effectively. We don't want to just do something and then, oh, okay, this area is it good to be used now for 10 or 15 years while it regenerates? That's not good for people either.
Mhm. So, but with things like environmentalism and climate change in mind, what is conservation and what are the kinds of approaches and tools that conservationists have at their disposal?
Yeah, so conservation is just, I would call the smart use of natural resources. So the
Yeah.
use of natural resources in some way where we're not depleting it. We're thinking about the future for us, for other species, and we're trying to use our resources in a way that's sustainable through time. So what was the second part of the question?
The kinds of approaches and tools that
Oh,
conservationists have at their disposal.
right. So I would say, in a lot of ways, anybody who's doing any kind of land management, anybody who's doing, agriculture, let's say, tree logging, tree farming,
Mhm.
everybody, I almost think of all those people as, conservationists, or at least very involved with conservation, because nobody wants to develop something and then have that area or land that you've been using, burn out within a short time. So
Mhm.
really everybody, I think that is thinking about natural resources is doing this in a way that they at least want it to be sustainable for themselves. Then they may not be thinking about the sustainability of broadly of, for example, broader biodiversity issues, but lots of times, people are still doing it for their own service. So that's a big one. One of the big things that conservationists, I would say, really do now is we try to think about protecting areas that are sort of natural already. So that's a big one where both, I would say private sectors, government, all sorts of groups of people are thinking about, all right, how do we protect the area that we currently have that's sort of a
Mhm.
natural or at least, managed, like parks, ecosystems. And then the other piece I think that's really big that people think about is restoration. All right, how do we make an area that has been degraded better again for the native species and biodiversity in that area. So those I think of as kind of the two ways that people are thinking about it, but there are many other many other ways that people think about conservation, and it really just depends. Like, are you focused on individual species? Are you focused on the community of species? Are you focused on the ecosystem processes? What exactly are you trying to conserve through time? And so, yeah, so there's a lot out there and a lot of innovative ways that people are thinking about it.
And are there any particular ways for us to decide or determine that we should try to conserve a particular species and not another one? Or how do we do that?
That's a really good question. I mean, so that's a really good question. I will say that in practice, it really does happen by what people care about, right? Like, we find out that, whether or not one species is getting conservation status in locally, regionally, and nationally, or conservation interventions really ends up depending on what people think about or what people care about. So there's this concept that we call charismatic megafauna or charismatic species. And the idea is that there are certain species, usually they're big, not always, that people really care about. You think about something like pandas or lions or even the monarch butterfly is one in North America. But iconic species that people really love. And I think a lot of decisions get based around that, what the public cares about. But also, I would say what scientists are thinking about, and people who are working on conservation, is they're also thinking about, all right, what are the species or processes that really matter? So another concept in ecology is the idea of keystone species, and that would be a species by which, if you remove them, the entire ecosystem may change, right? So if we took out, for example, wolves in North America is one, right? When we remove the top predator in there, we've seen high increases of things like deer, elk, browsing ungulates, and that's led to lower loss of a lot of different herbaceous species and really big changes then to ecosystems. So there can be, that's kind of some of what we're thinking about when we're thinking about what's the best thing to do from an ecological standpoint. How do we keep this ecosystem intact and functional to the best of our ability? But that doesn't always match with the policy or what the public wants. So I think, in practice, what happens is not really the decision of scientists.
Yeah, because I would imagine that it's much easier for people to empathize with mammals, for example, animals that are closer to us and that are cuter, let's say, but then other kinds of animals like insects or even fish and even plants, fungi, and other species like that.
Right, that's right. And the thing about it is, we fail to consider that, like, all right, those insects, they're performing very, very important ecosystem services. And so it's important that we're thinking broadly and not just about those species, that we like or visit in the zoo or that sort of thing. But that's tricky, and it's a value judgment in some ways. It's not always an ecological decision, certainly what gets conservation.
So, and what is an invasive species?
So we talked a little bit about native species, and those are species that historically have lived in an area. So non-native species are species that within some sort of time frame are not species that have been there. So they've been introduced in some ways. Usually we think about this as the facilitation of people introducing them, which is what is happening, around the globe. So in some instances, non-native species can move into an ecosystem and they don't really change things that much. But in some cases, and those are species that we call invasive species, there are cases where the species comes in and it really, really changes an ecosystem, right? So, and it can lead to all sorts of things. So, for example, there is a fungal pathogen that we call BD, and it has been transported around the world, really facilitated by humans. And that's led to the loss of amphibians, frogs in many, many locations across the Americas, but also in other parts of the world as well. So sometimes we see something like happen. There's classical examples of that, kind of with rats everywhere, with rats being introduced and coming in and changing ecosystems. There's lots of introduced stories out of Australia. So for example, cane toad, I don't know if you've heard about cane toad, but that's a
No.
species that was introduced into Australia quite some time ago to control something. I don't remember what they introduced it for. So people came, brought it, but it's very poisonous, and other species, it didn't never control the pests that they wanted to control. And then it's very toxic. So other species would eat it and die. So it really, and it's spread throughout Australia, right? So there's lots of examples of where, species have come in and then very, very much changed the ecosystem. So in those cases, it tends to become pretty important to do active management to try and mitigate the negative impacts of an invasive species into some region.
And I would imagine that many times this sort of process of introducing new species in a particular ecology where they would be invasive or have some detrimental effects on the ecosystem there would be done unintentionally, right? So even
Yeah,
just
right.
people traveling or moving around, I mean, we carry at the very least bacteria with us. So
Right. Yeah, I would say certainly now, right? People are really, there aren't so much, or you don't see, I would say the last 50 years or something like that, this kind of management where oh, let's just bring this species into this area and dump it there, right? Because people know how much that's backfired at places around the world. But it happens all the time where they get moved in. So for example, there's a fish called sea lamprey, and it preys on native fish. It's actually an ocean fish, and it's actually a really prehistoric fish. I encourage your watchers to look it up. It's got this rows of teeth. It sucks onto a fish. Anyways, it's made it through the Great Lakes, right? Because we made all these canals and series of ways so that the lakes would reach out to the ocean and boats could move back and forth. Well, it's in all the Great Lakes, and it's caused a huge loss, a huge decline in native fish in those areas. And people, both commercially and recreationally, you know, fish, eat those fish, right? Rely on that sustenance. So it can have really, really big effects. And most of the time I would say, yeah, now, it's something that's done unintentionally.
And if we've already introduced invasive species into a new ecosystem, a new environment, what different kinds of ways do we have to control them?
Unfortunately, if there's a species so sometimes it happens, right, that you introduce a non-native species, and again, it's not so bad. But once we start introducing species that have really negative consequences, invasive ones, it's almost impossible to remove them. And we see this over and over again. So the main thing that people try to then do is just slow the spread. So there's this Asian carp that's coming up through the Mississippi River, and they're working really hard to, prevent it from coming into the Great Lakes. So the idea is to spend as much time as we can to control where it is rather than eradicating it. It's almost impossible. I mean, you could think about that kind of with coronavirus, right? Like once it gets to a certain size, you can't really contain it, but you can have strategies maybe to mitigate its spread or something like that. So it's a little bit like that. But there's really very, very few situations during which where you could really, get rid or could seriously control a invasive species without a lot of active management all the time. So there's an example right now where in the United States, the government is planning, I don't know if they're still planning to do this, but they were talking about planning killing really thousands of barred owls. And the reason for that is because they're moving in. They're invasive. They weren't naturally in the western part of the US, but they've moved in probably They moved in by themselves. They weren't moved by people,
Mhm.
but they were facilitated by the development of people that have come around. And they're outcompeted an endangered species there called the spotted owl. Um, but the problem is, I mean, one, there's obviously an issue that people have to contend with do we really want to kill thousands of birds? But second, I think is the real, very, very real possibility that it won't really be effective, right? And even
Mhm.
if it was effective for a short time, you'd have to keep killing a lot of birds, a lot of the barred owls to prevent them from outcompeting the spotted owls, which are smaller and use the same habitat. So that's kind of an example where, it's just really, really hard to control once they're established.
And if we try to control invasive species, could it happen that sometimes it backfires? And if
Yeah,
so,
so
how?
that's a yeah, I think the backfire line is from a paper that I wrote. This is actually in my master's. My master's, one of the first papers that I worked on where smallmouth bass had been introduced to northern lakes. So that used to happen in the US quite a lot. People like to fish them. They don't necessarily eat them as much anymore, but they'd
Mhm.
introduce them to all these northern lakes and they'd kind of take over. They were one of those invasive species, although brought in by people, where they really changed the ecosystem. They changed, they outcompeted native trout species, and they changed kind of the whole dynamics of biodiversity in the lake. So one of the problems that we worked on is this was a collaborative team at Cornell University where they were trying to, okay, can we remove them, right? Using certain size nets and electroshock fishing, can we remove them and what's going to happen? So what ended up happening is it became, you can't really, right away you realize, okay, you can't get all the smallmouth bass out of the lake. Even this is a closed lake, wasn't that big. I think it was like 271 hectares, so not huge. But right away you start to realize, okay, we can't get rid of all of them. But what we actually found is when they went around and took out kind of some of the bigger ones, the ones that you catch, the next year and then the subsequent years after that, there were more individuals than there previously had been, and they were all kind of small. So they were a tiny, small size class. What had happened is those very, very big individuals that are really hard to catch basically can just produce tons of offspring. And then we
Mhm.
would see more individuals than we had prior to the initiation of the removal. Of course, there was less biomass because you were removing some of those medium-sized, bigger groups of fish, but there were more overall individuals, right? And that it really becomes this game of, okay, how do you keep this up, right? It's
Mhm.
very, very difficult. So again, one of those stories where controlling invasive species, if it's very difficult to do, and if you do it, you're probably going to be doing it forever. Um, you
Right.
can't really stop.
But since we're going through climate change, I need to ask you, I mean, what are perhaps some of the most negative effects that climate change can have on biodiversity, species distribution, and other things like that?
Yeah, this is a really, really good question. I mean, again, so we talked about this idea that there's always some winners and there's always some losers. And what we've been seeing with climate change is there really are more losers than they are winners in a lot of
Mhm.
instances. So, the temperatures change, the precipitation changes, that changes all sorts of what's available for resources, the plant communities. And what we find is that in a lot of cases in a community, whether it's birds, it's butterflies, amphibians, other kinds of species, mammals, a lot of times what we find is that tends to have a negative impact on most species. So most species end up declining, and we
Mhm.
see, fewer of them, or they restrict their range, they move to different areas. So we see that a lot. But on the flip side, there are a few species that are really winners. And
Mhm.
they tend to have certain kinds of traits, they could be more adaptable, they have a wider range, maybe of temperature uh abilities to be in different temperatures. And maybe they can make use of different kinds of habitat or resources, some sorts of generalist flexibilities. So some of those species then will increase. We'll find that some of those increase. And then what we see kind of through time is what we call, and space, time and space is what we call biotic homogenization. And that is that areas that used to be really different, that used to have all different sorts of species, might become more similar through time. And I mean, one, there's this intrinsic value, right, to the variety of Earth, I think, across the world, right? People love to see different kinds of beautiful species of butterflies and birds and enjoy that, that variety of life. But also what we find, so there's that, but also what we find is we could lose specific functions. So, different types of birds play different roles in ecosystems. Some eat fruit, some eat fruit, some eat seeds, some eat other birds, some eat insects. There's all different variety, and those have really important roles that make an ecosystem function. So when we see this biotic homogenization, we see more and more of the same, and places around the globe looking more similar to each other than they used to be. And that loss, that could be a big loss for people through time, right? Because that could lead to things like lower food production, less opportunity to find medicines, in plants, and all sorts of other things that might be repercussions of that, right? Inability of water to get cleaned. There are natural ways by which ecosystems help preserve clean water and clean air, and so we could see those functions diminishing and it becoming harder to maintain those kind of all those things that we really take for granted that biodiversity gives us.
So at the end of the day, even if we have a few winner species, that is not good enough to compensate the fact that we are losing all the other species, or some of the other species, or is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how it will play out everywhere and through time.
Mhm,
But in general, people benefit from a wide variety of biodiversity, right? Because it
mhm,
basically gives us more options, right? If we're trying to look for a new medicine, for a new disease that comes up, we want to have more options available to us, right? We don't want to
yeah.
inadvertently having made that specific plant go extinct, right? So, in some cases, maybe it won't matter too much, in specific locations at specific times that will have the functions that we need through the biodiversity that's there. But in other cases, I mean, we already see that can cause huge rippling effects, right? So the loss of some species groups or some types of species can impact other species and lead to these kinds of cascades where you're having really important biodiversity loss that you may not even really be able to measure because you never knew what the baseline was there. And that happens, in the tropics or other areas where
Mhm.
there's lots of species we don't even necessarily know. So I would say, it's kind of like the precautionary principle. If you're not sure it's going to be good right into the future, you want to be a little bit careful about what you do. And that's kind of how I think of biodiversity, right? It's this amazing kind of resource that we have on the planet that sustains life, not just for those organisms that are there, but for all of us, all the people and everything. So we want to be careful about what we do to lose that. It may have really big impact for us and our children down the road.
So my last question will be then, and this is circling all the way back to our first question. So, I mean, is it possible with the knowledge, the scientific knowledge we have and the tools we have at our disposal to predict how particular populations, specifically animal populations, will react to climate change?
Yeah, so that is one thing that we're working on a lot.
Mhm,
What's the future going to look like? And the reasons we want to know that is because we want to know what kinds of interventions or things that we should or can do that might make things better, right?
mhm,
And I would say, okay, the short answer is no. It's not possible to predict what's the future. And the reason for that is, right, we don't know what climate change itself is really going to look like, right?
yeah.
So there's lots of different models out there that show all right, here's what we think may be happening if, we see 1 degree Celsius, 2 degrees Celsius, all those sorts of things. But we don't really know how it will play out, how it will play out across the globes. And even those are called global circulation models, GCMs, that are trying across the world to, predict what the climate might look like and weather patterns might look like under different climate change scenarios. But each one of those models, there's different groups around the world that take a ton of computing power. Each one of those around the world is making predictions, and they're not the same, right? Because there's all different kinds of nuance that are difficult to bring in. And then the same thing about, so there's this uncertainty about what the environment will look like in the future. And then the other thing is we have an uncertainty about what we know for the animals, for species and for biodiversity. We can only, data are just data. They're not perfect. And same thing with our models. If it was, if we could create a model that was reality, we would just call it reality, right? So the model by definition is going to be wrong. It's an imperfect description that we have of the environment and what we think is going on. So we know it won't be correct. And we can kind of try to understand, which we do all the time, where or what are the pieces that we think we don't know that well. So really, I would say with the prediction, what we're really trying to do is have this uncertainty about what that future climate looks like, plus this uncertainty about our understanding of how species respond to environmental variables. And we can put that together and we can give you what we think about is not predicting the future, which is impossible, but predicting out what probabilities of different things that we might see. Is there a high probability that this population will decline into the future in these areas under certain conditions or not? So that's kind of the thing that we try to look at, not necessarily what the future will be, but how much confidence do we have in these possible different scenarios? The species fine, the species increases, the species decreasing, right? That sort of thing under different scenarios. So we'll never know what the future holds, but we try to think about what could happen under different scenarios. And if we could say, all right, look, 70% chance this trajectory is going to happen, even if we see different climate scenarios, that's useful, right? And then we can think about into the future, how do we plan for that? Knowing it's not certain, right? Knowing it's not certain with some flexibility in there, but how can we plan for that and think about where might we want to do conservation? What would be the best approaches? What's likely to work? That sort of thing.
Great. So just before we go, would you like to let people know where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I have a website, www.zipkinlab.org, and there's more information there. All our papers, the peer-reviewed papers that we publish are free on there, so anybody can, access the work that we do. We also publish all the code for all our models too. There's a link on there to our GitHub repo, because one of the things that I think is really important is open science, and that what we do is reproducible and can be used by others to make it better into the future, So that's another thing I think, that can help this process along.
Great. So I'm leaving the links in the description of the interview below. So Dr. Zipkin, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the
Yes,
show. It's
thank you
been
for
a
having
real
me.
pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's been really interesting.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Erga Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.